Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation of Steel. Julius Little stood at his workshop window, watching the autumn leaves spiral down onto the gravel driveway of his sprawling Montana ranch. At 35, his hands bore the calluses of a man who'd built his empire from the ground up, first as a welder in the oil fields, then as the owner of Little Steel Works, the most successful custom metalworking company in 3 counties. His father, Gregory Little, had taught him 2 fundamental truths. Trust was earned in drops and lost in buckets, and a man's word was his bond until someone broke theirs first. The workshop behind him housed not just industrial equipment, but specialized tools most people would never recognize. Julius had always been methodical, precise, qualities that serve him well in business and would serve him even better in other pursuits. His gray eyes, inherited from his grandfather who'd survived the Korean War, missed nothing. They'd served him well when he caught his first business partner skimming profits 7 years ago. That man, Derek Glass, now worked construction in another state after Julius had systematically dismantled his reputation and financial standing. Julius never forgot, and he certainly never forgave. His cell phone buzzed against the steel workbench. Candace's photo illuminated the screen. His wife of 8 years, currently 6 months pregnant with what she claimed was their second child. Their first, Roman, was 6 years old and possessed an unsettling perceptiveness that often caught adults off guard. The boy had his father's eyes and his grandfather's instincts. "Hey, beautiful," Julius answered, though something in his gut had been churning for months. "Julius, I'm at the clinic for my regular checkup. Dr. Miranda wants to discuss the due date. Seems like the baby might come earlier than expected." Her voice carried that particular strain he'd been noticing lately, the kind that came when someone was managing multiple stories. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Julius ended the call and walked to his gun safe, retrieving a small digital recorder he'd purchased months ago. His instincts, honed by years of dealing with suppliers who tried to shortchange him and employees who thought they could steal from him, had been screaming warnings about his wife's behavior. The late-night phone calls she claimed were from her sister Margaret in Denver. The new clothes and lingerie she said were gifts from friends. The way she'd started showering immediately after coming home from her book club meetings. Julius had learned long ago that when something felt wrong, it usually was. His father had discovered his own wife's affair when Julius was 12, and the lesson had been brutal. Gregory Little had methodically destroyed the man who'd touched his wife, and then divorced her without a penny of alimony. "Son," his father had said, "forgiveness is for the weak. Justice is for men like us." As Julius drove toward town, his mind cataloged the inconsistencies in Candace's recent behavior. The supposed book club that met on Tuesday nights. Julius had driven by the location once and found it empty. The new expensive handbag she claimed to have bought with money from selling her grandmother's jewelry that was still in their bedroom safe. The way she'd started arguments over trivial matters, as if she were trying to create distance between them. But what bothered him most was how she'd been treating Roman lately. His son had always been close to his mother, but recently the boy had been watching her with the same analytical intensity Julius recognized in himself. Children, Julius knew, often saw truths that adults worked hard to hide. Dr. Pauline Miranda's office sat in the medical complex downtown, and Julius arrived to find Candace already in the waiting room, scrolling through her phone with nervous energy. She looked up as he entered, and for just a moment, he saw something flicker across her face. Guilt, perhaps, or fear. "The appointment isn't for another 10 minutes, she said, standing to embrace him. Her perfume was different again, something expensive and musky that she'd never worn during their 8 years together. "Wanted to make sure I didn't miss anything important," Julius replied, studying her face. "How's our baby doing?" The way she hesitated before answering told him everything he needed to know. Candace Chung had been many things when he'd married her. Ambitious, beautiful, passionate, but she'd never been a good liar. She'd grown up in San Francisco, the daughter of second-generation immigrants who'd built a successful restaurant chain through brutal work and sacrifice. Her parents, Tommy and Lucia Chung, had taught her about family loyalty and hard work, values that had initially attracted Julius to her. Now, watching her fidget with her wedding ring as she avoided his direct gaze, Julius felt the cold calculation that had served him so well in business begin to crystallize around his heart. If his suspicions were correct, if Candace had chosen to betray the foundation of their family, then she would learn what happened to people who broke faith with Julius Little. The nurse called them back, and as they walked down the hallway, Julius noticed how Candace's phone buzzed constantly in her purse. She'd started keeping it on silent recently, another red flag in his growing collection. In the examination room, Dr. Miranda's demeanor seemed slightly uncomfortable as she discussed the pregnancy's progression. "Everything looks healthy," the doctor said, avoiding eye contact with Julius. "The baby's development is right on track for the due date we discussed." Julius watched the interplay between his wife and the doctor, noting the subtle communication that seemed to flow between them. When Dr. Miranda mentioned scheduling the next appointment, Candace was quick to suggest a time when Julius will be traveling for business, another piece of the puzzle falling into place. Driving home, Julius made his decision. Tomorrow, he would begin the systematic investigation that would either confirm his suspicions or put his mind at ease. He'd learned long ago that knowledge was power, and if his wife was playing games, he intended to know every rule before he started playing back. That evening, as they sat down for dinner with Roman, Julius studied his family with new eyes. His son picked at his food, glancing between his parents with an expression far too mature for a 6-year-old. Candace chattered nervously about her day, filling silences that had never existed before. "Dad," Roman said suddenly, "can I ask you something?" "Always, son. If someone was lying to you, would you want to know? Even if it hurt?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Julius felt Candace stiffen beside him, her fork clattering against her plate. In that moment, he realized his son had already seen what Julius was only beginning to suspect. "Yes," Julius answered carefully. "I'd always want to know the truth. Truth is the foundation everything else is built on. Without it, nothing else matters." Roman nodded solemnly, and Julius caught the boy stealing a glance at his mother that carried the weight of secrets. As Julius tucked his son into bed that night, Roman grabbed his father's hand. "Dad, sometimes grown-ups think kids don't see things. But we do. We see everything." Julius kissed his son's forehead, understanding that whatever was coming, Roman would be his ally, not his burden. The foundation had been laid, and now it was time to discover exactly what was being built upon it. Chapter 2. Cracks in the Foundation. 3 weeks after the clinic visit, Julius had compiled a file that would have impressed a private investigator. He'd installed tracking software on the family's shared computer, positioned motion-activated cameras around his property, and begun documenting every inconsistency in his wife's behavior. What he discovered exceeded even his darkest suspicions. The man's name was Brandon Calhoun, and he owned a high-end construction company that specialized in luxury homes for the wealthy residents moving into Montana from California and New York. At 38, Calhoun had a reputation for charm and ruthlessness that had earned him both success and enemies. He was also married to a woman named Paige, with 2 children of his own. Julius had learned this through a combination of public record searches and casual inquiries to mutual business contacts. What made the betrayal particularly bitter was that Julius had known Calhoun for years. They'd even collaborated on projects where Julius's metalwork complemented Calhoun's construction. The man had been in Julius's home, had shaken his hand, had eaten meals at their table while likely planning to seduce his wife. The evidence was overwhelming. Credit card receipts showing Candace at restaurants and hotels during times she'd claimed to be at book club. Security footage from a boutique hotel downtown showing her entering with Calhoun on multiple occasions. Phone records revealing hundreds of calls and text messages between them, often in the early hours of the morning when Julius was asleep. But the most damning evidence came from the medical records Julius obtained through a contact at the clinic. Dr. Miranda had been covering for Candace, adjusting dates, and providing false information about the pregnancy timeline. The baby wasn't due in 3 months, it was due in 6 weeks, and the conception date made it impossible for Julius to be the father. The child Candace carried belonged to Brandon Calhoun. Julius sat in his workshop at midnight, studying photographs of his wife and her lover entering a cabin that Calhoun owned in the mountains. The images were crystal clear, capturing intimate moments that destroyed any possibility of innocent explanation. His hands, steady as they'd always been when welding intricate metalwork, trembled slightly as he filed the photos with the rest of his evidence. The rage he felt wasn't the hot, explosive anger of a man discovering betrayal in the moment. It was cold, methodical, and patient, the kind of fury that had been inherited through generations of little men who understood that revenge was a dish best served with precision. His phone buzzed with a text from Roman, who was supposedly asleep upstairs. "Dad, I know you're awake. Can I come down?" Julius quickly secured his files and replied, "Come down, son." Roman appeared in the workshop doorway, wearing his dinosaur pajamas, his expression serious beyond his years. "I heard Mom on the phone again. She was crying and telling someone she couldn't keep lying." Julius motioned for his son to sit on the stool beside his workbench. "What else did you hear?" "She said she was scared of what you'd do if you found out. And she said something about the baby not being." Roman paused, struggling with words too adult for his vocabulary. "She said the baby doesn't belong to you." The confirmation from his son's lips should have hurt more, but Julius felt only the cold clarity that came with having his suspicions validated. He wrapped an arm around Roman's shoulders. "Son, what your mother is doing is called betrayal. It's when someone breaks the trust that families are built on. Do you understand?" Roman nodded. "Like when Tommy Thompson at school promised he wouldn't tell anyone my secret, but then he told everyone anyway?" "Exactly like that, but much worse. When adults betray each other, especially in families, it breaks things that can't be fixed. Are you going to divorce her like Grandpa Gregory did with Grandma?" Julius considered his answer carefully. His father's approach had been swift and legal: divorce, custody battles, and financial settlements. But Julius had learned from his father's experience. Gregory Little had let his wife and her lover walk away with their lives intact, merely damaged reputations and empty bank accounts. Julius intended to be more thorough. "Son, your mother made choices that hurt our family. She chose to be with another man while carrying his baby and lying to us about it. Those choices have consequences." "What kind of consequences?" Julius studied his son's face, seeing in it the same cold intelligence that had served the little family for generations. The kind that makes sure she never hurts anyone else the way she hurt us. Roman was quiet for a moment, processing information that most children his age couldn't comprehend. Finally, he looked up at his father with eyes that held no childish innocence. "What do you need me to do?" The question sent a chill through Julius, not because he was horrified by his son's offer, but because he recognized the same ruthless pragmatism that had built their family's success. Roman wasn't asking out of malice. He was asking out of loyalty to the family unit that Candace had chosen to destroy. "For now, just keep watching and listening. Your mother doesn't know that we know, and we need to keep it that way until I'm ready." "Ready for what?" Julius looked around his workshop, taking in the industrial equipment, the specialized tools, and the soundproof walls he'd installed for noise reduction. Everything a man might need to solve problems that couldn't be handled through conventional means. "Ready to make sure justice is served, son. The kind of justice that ensures some mistakes are never repeated." Over the following days, Julius refined his plan with a methodical precision that had made him successful in business. He studied Brandon Calhoun's routines, identifying patterns and vulnerabilities. He researched Paige Calhoun, Brandon's wife, learning about her schedule and habits. He quietly liquidated assets, moving money into accounts that couldn't be easily traced. Most importantly, he began preparing his workshop for activities that went far beyond metalworking. Candace, meanwhile, continued her charade with increasing desperation. Her book club meetings became more frequent, and her lies more elaborate. She started arguments over minor issues, perhaps trying to justify her infidelity by painting Julius as an inattentive husband. She spoke more frequently about how confined she felt on the ranch, how she missed the excitement of city life. Each lie, each manufactured argument, Each moment of false affection added fuel to the cold fire burning in Julius's chest. She'd had countless opportunities to confess, to end the deception, to show some semblance of remorse. Instead, she doubled down on her betrayal, even going so far as to plan a baby shower for what she continued to claim was Julius's child. The breaking point came when Julius discovered that Candace and Brandon had been discussing their future together. Text messages between them revealed plans for Candace to leave Julius after the baby was born, taking Roman and seeking a generous divorce settlement that would fund their new life together. They'd even discussed how to manipulate the custody proceedings to ensure Julius had minimal contact with Roman. That night, Julius sat in his workshop making final preparations. Tomorrow would be the day that Candace went to the hospital for what she thought would be a routine checkup, but what Dr. Miranda had privately confirmed would likely result in early labor. The baby, Brandon's child, will be born into a world where consequences had finally caught up with its parents. Julius checked his supplies one final time. Industrial zip ties, soundproofing materials, chemicals that could dissolve organic matter, and tools that could cut through bone as easily as steel. His grandfather's war medals watched from their display case, and Julius felt the approval of generations of little men who understood that some betrayals demanded more than legal recourse. Roman appeared in the doorway, somehow knowing that his father needed him without being called. "Is it time, Dad?" Julius looked at his son, truly looked at him, and saw not the child he'd been protecting, but the young man he was becoming. A young man who understood that family loyalty was earned through actions, not blood, and that betrayal carried consequences that legal systems were too weak to enforce. Soon, son. Very soon. Chapter 3, The Awakening. The call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. Candace's contractions had started unexpectedly, and Dr. Miranda recommended they come to the hospital immediately. Julius dressed quickly, noting how his wife's face was pale with more than just labor pains. She looked terrified, as if she knew her carefully constructed lies were about to collide with reality. "Should I call my sister?" Candace asked as they drove through the empty streets toward Pine Ridge Hospital. "Which sister?" Julius replied calmly. "Margaret in Denver? Or the sister who doesn't exist that you've been using as an alibi?" The silence that followed was electric. Candace's breathing grew shallower and not from the contractions. "Julius, I don't know what you..." "Candace." His voice cut through her attempted denial like a blade. "We're about to walk into a hospital where you're going to give birth to Brandon Calhoun's child. The child you've been pretending is mine for the past 6 months. The least you can do is stop lying for the next few hours." Her sobs started then, ugly and desperate. But Julius felt no pity. He'd offered her countless opportunities to confess, to end the deception, to show even a shred of remorse. Instead, she continued lying even as her body prepared to deliver the ultimate proof of her betrayal. At the hospital, the medical staff moved with practiced efficiency. Julius played the part of the concerned husband, holding Candace's hand during contractions while she whispered frantic apologies between waves of pain. Dr. Miranda avoided his eyes, clearly aware that her role in the deception had been discovered. "Julius, please," Candace gasped as another contraction peaked. "Let me explain. It wasn't supposed to happen. Brandon and I, we never meant for it to go this far." "How far did you mean for it to go?" Julius asked conversationally. "Just the affair, or were you planning to tell me eventually that you were leaving me for him? Maybe after you'd secured a favorable divorce settlement?" Her shocked expression confirmed that he'd accurately reconstructed their plans. During the brief respite between contractions, Julius leaned close to her ear. "I know about the cabin. I know about the hotel meetings. I know about the text messages discussing our future custody arrangements. I know about the plans you and Brandon made to start a new life with my money and my son." "How could you know?" "Because I'm not the trusting fool you apparently thought you married. I'm a little Candace. We don't forgive and we don't forget. We collect evidence and then we act." The labor progressed rapidly, and by dawn, Brandon Calhoun's son had entered the world. The baby's features left no doubt about paternity. He had Brandon's distinctive cleft chin and eye shape. Dr. Miranda's discomfort was palpable as she avoided making any comments about family resemblance. Julius called Roman from the hospital corridor. "Son, it's time for our visit. Bring the bag we prepared. Is Mom sleeping? She will be soon." The doctors gave her medication for the pain. An hour later, Roman arrived at the hospital carrying a small overnight bag. His expression was solemn as they walked toward Candace's room. Through the window, they could see her sleeping peacefully, the baby in a bassinet beside her bed. "She looks so tired," Roman observed. "Lying takes a lot of energy," Julius replied, "especially when you're lying to people who love you." As they entered the room, Roman moved with unusual purpose. Without being asked, he quietly closed the curtain around his mother's bed and turned to his father. "Hide under the bed right now," he whispered urgently. Confused but trusting his son's instincts, Julius followed Roman's lead. They crouched together in a narrow space beneath the hospital bed, Roman's small hand gripping his father's tightly. Moments later, footsteps approached from the hallway. Multiple sets, moving with deliberate stealth. Julius heard the door open softly, then Brandon Calhoun's voice, low and tense. "Is she awake?" "Still sedated," came Dr. Miranda's reply. "But we don't have much time. Julius has been asking questions. I can't keep deflecting." "Did you call Paige?" This was a woman's voice Julius didn't recognize. "She's handling things at home," Brandon answered, "making sure there's no evidence of our communications. Once Candace recovers enough to travel, we can proceed with the plan we discussed." Under the bed, Julius felt his blood turn to ice as he listened to them discuss logistics for Candace's disappearance with the baby. They planned not just to divorce him, but to vanish entirely, taking Roman through a custody battle while destroying Julius financially through false domestic abuse allegations. "What about the kid?" the unknown woman asked. "Roman stays here," Brandon said dismissively. "He's Julius's problem. We only need Candace and the baby." Roman's grip on his father's hand tightened, and Julius saw in his son's eyes the same cold fury that ran through little family blood. They just heard themselves dismissed as disposable obstacles to Brandon and Candace's new life. The conversation continued for several more minutes, covering details about fake identification documents, offshore accounts, and a planned route through Canada to a new life in Europe. Julius memorized every word while calculating the modifications his plan would require. Finally, the conspirators left, but not before Brandon placed a burner phone beside Candace's bed and instructed Dr. Miranda to ensure she received it upon waking. The door closed, and after waiting several minutes, Julius and Roman emerged from their hiding place. "Dad," Roman whispered, his young voice carrying a cold certainty that would have been disturbing in any other family. "They were going to take me away from you." "I heard, son." "And they call me your problem?" Julius studied his son's face, seeing not trauma, but resolve. Roman had heard himself written off as collateral damage in his mother's escape plan, and the experience had crystallized something fundamental in his character. "What do we do now?" Roman asked. Julius looked down at his wife, still sedated, unaware that her carefully laid plans had been exposed. The baby slept in his bassinet, innocent of the deception that had brought him into the world. Dr. Miranda had left additional paperwork on the bedside table, documents that would need to be signed for the birth certificate, establishing legal parentage. "Now we make sure justice is served," Julius said quietly. "The kind of justice that ensures some people never hurt anyone again." He pulled out his phone and began making calls. The first was to his lawyer, Wilson Saunders, with instructions to begin immediate proceedings to challenge paternity. The second was to a contact in law enforcement who owed him favors from his days working oil field security. But the third call was the most important. It went to Felix Owens, a man who specialized in solving problems that couldn't be handled through legal channels. Felix had served with Julius's father in Korea and shared the little family's philosophy about consequences and justice. "Felix, it's Julius. I need to discuss a situation that requires your particular expertise. I'll be there in 2 hours." As Julius ended the call, Roman tugged at his sleeve. "Dad, what happens to the baby?" Julius looked at the sleeping infant, Brandon Calhoun's son, the living proof of his wife's betrayal. The child was innocent, but he was also evidence of a crime against the foundation of Julius's family. The baby goes to his real father, Julius said simply. Eventually, Candace stirred in her sleep, and Julius motioned for Roman to remain quiet. Soon she would wake to find her world fundamentally changed. The burner phone would be gone, replaced by evidence of her conspiracy. Dr. Miranda would discover that her medical license was under investigation for ethical violations. And Brandon Calhoun would learn that some men didn't settle for divorce court when their families were destroyed. Julius Little was about to demonstrate why his family had survived and prospered for generations, and why crossing them was a mistake people rarely live to repeat. The hospital room fell silent, except for the steady beeping of medical equipment and the soft breathing of a sleeping woman who had no idea that her judgment day was about to begin. Chapter 4. The Reckoning Begins. Candace woke to find Julius sitting beside her bed, reading a newspaper as if nothing had changed. The baby was gone from his bassinet, and Dr. Miranda was nowhere to be seen. Panic flickered across her face as she struggled to sit up. "Where's the baby?" she asked, her voice hoarse from sleep and sedation. "With his father," Julius replied without looking up from his paper. "Brandon came by while you were sleeping. Had an interesting conversation with Dr. Miranda about falsified medical records." The color drained from Candace's face. "Julius, please let me explain." "No need." He folded the newspaper and finally looked at her, his gray eyes carrying the cold finality of a judge delivering a sentence. "I heard your explanation last night, along with your plans to disappear with my son and your lover's child, along with the domestic abuse allegations you intended to fabricate, along with the financial destruction you had mapped out for our divorce." Candace's breathing grew rapid and shallow. "You couldn't have known. Roman and I were under your bed when you, Brandon, and Dr. Miranda discussed your escape plans. My 6-year-old son heard himself dismissed as Julius's problem by the man you chose over your family." The machine monitoring Candace's heart rate began beeping faster. She reached for the nurse call button, but Julius gently intercepted her hand. "Dr. Miranda won't be responding to calls. She's currently meeting with the state medical board about her role in falsifying pregnancy records and participating in conspiracy to commit fraud. Her career is over, Candace, just like yours." "What do you mean?" Julius stood and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where Felix Owens was positioning his van. "I mean that every choice has consequences. You chose to betray your family. You chose to lie about your pregnancy. You chose to plan our destruction. Now you get to experience the consequences of those choices. You can't just take the baby. He needs his mother. He needs his father, the real one. Brandon should be receiving him shortly, along with a comprehensive file documenting your affair and conspiracy. I'm sure Paige Calhoun will find the information particularly enlightening." Julius turned back to face his wife, and she saw in his expression something that made her instinctively try to push herself deeper into the hospital bed. This wasn't the man she'd married. This was someone harder, colder, more dangerous. "Julius, please. We can work this out. We can go to counseling. We can't do anything, Candace. There is no we anymore. You ended that when you decided Brandon Calhoun's child was more important than the family you destroyed to create him." The door opened, and Roman entered carrying a small suitcase. His expression was unnaturally composed for a 6-year-old who'd just learned his mother had planned to abandon his father and steal him away. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly. "Dad thought you might want some of your things for the trip you're taking." "What trip?" Candace's voice was barely a whisper. Roman opened the suitcase, revealing not clothes, but photographs, documents, and recordings. Julius's evidence file, meticulously organized and devastating in its completeness. "The trip where you explained to everyone who matters why you chose to destroy our family," Julius said. "Starting with your parents." Candace's face went white. "You wouldn't tell Tommy and Lucia." "I already have. They're flying in from San Francisco this afternoon. They're very interested in learning why their daughter chose to humiliate her family and abandon her son." Julius pulled a chair close to Candace's bed and sat down, his voice taking on the same tone he used when negotiating business deals that would determine other people's livelihoods. Here's what's going to happen, Candace. You're going to sign paternity documents establishing that Brandon Calhoun is the father of the child you just delivered. You're going to sign custody papers giving me full custody of Roman. You're going to sign a postnuptial agreement transferring all marital assets to me in exchange for not pursuing criminal charges for fraud. You can't make me. I can and I will. Because the alternative is much worse for everyone involved. Brandon Calhoun doesn't know yet that his wife Paige is currently receiving copies of every text message, every photo, every hotel receipt, and every plan you two made together. He doesn't know that his business licenses are under review for connections to fraudulent activities. He doesn't know that the IRS has been provided with information about the offshore accounts he's been hiding. Julius leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more menace than any shout. But mostly, he doesn't know that some people don't settle family disputes through lawyers and divorce courts. Some people handle betrayal the way my family has handled it for generations. What are you saying? Roman, still standing by the window, spoke up in his clear, young voice. Dad saying that bad people who hurt families don't get to just walk away and start over. They get stopped. The coldness in his son's words sent a chill through Julius, not because he disapproved, but because he recognized the birth of something that would serve Roman well in a world where weakness invited victimization. Candace, Julius continued, you have one opportunity to minimize the damage you've caused. Sign the papers, accept the consequences of your choices, and disappear from our lives. In exchange, Brandon gets to live long enough to regret his part in this. You're threatening to kill him? I'm explaining that some betrayals carry consequences that go beyond financial settlements and custody arrangements. Brandon touched my wife, planned to steal my son, and conspired to destroy my life. In some parts of the world, in some families, that carries a death sentence. Julius stood and moved toward the door. You have 2 hours to decide, Candace. Sign the papers and accept exile, or force me to solve this problem using methods that won't leave you any choices at all. What about the baby? You can't just. The baby goes to his father, who's about to learn what it feels like to have his world destroyed by consequences he never saw coming. After that, nature will take its course. As Julius reached for the door handle, Candace called out desperately, and if I sign everything? If I do what you want? Julius paused without turning around. Then you get to live with the knowledge that you destroyed your family for a man who's about to discover that betraying Julius Little was the last mistake he'll ever make. The door closed behind father and son, leaving Candace alone with the documents that would seal her fate and the growing understanding that she'd underestimated the man she'd chosen to betray. Outside, Felix Owens waited with tools and expertise that would ensure Brandon Calhoun's lesson and consequences would be both thorough and permanent. The reckoning had begun, and Julius Little was just getting started. Chapter 5. The Trap Springs. Felix Owens studied the photographs Julius had spread across the workshop table. At 62, Felix moved with the careful economy of a man who'd spent decades making problems disappear. His scarred hands traced the images of Brandon Calhoun's daily routines. His morning jog through the hills behind his house, his lunch meetings at the Timber Creek Cafe, his evening visits to a private gym outside town. Clean habits, Felix observed. Predictable schedule. The kind of man who thinks success makes him untouchable. He's about to learn otherwise, Julius replied, watching Roman organize surveillance equipment with the methodical precision of a much older person. What's our timeline? Candace signed the papers this morning. Brandon's wife Paige received her care package an hour ago. Photos, bank records, text messages, hotel receipts. She threw him out before noon. He's currently at the Riverside Motel, room 237, drinking himself into self-pity. Julius nodded. Brandon's world was collapsing according to plan, but that was only the beginning. The man who destroyed his family needed to understand the full weight of consequences before those consequences became final. Roman, Julius called to his son. What did you learn at school today? Tommy Thompson asked why Mom wasn't at the parent conference yesterday. Roman replied, without looking up from the electronic equipment he was sorting. I told him she was sick and might be sick for a very long time. Good boy. Felix raised an eyebrow at the exchange. In most families, such a conversation would be deeply disturbing. In the little family, it was simply practical preparation for a world where loyalty was earned and betrayal was punished. The child understands what we're doing, Felix asked quietly. Roman understands that family means something, Julius corrected. He understands that when people hurt your family, you hurt them back. He's seen his mother choose another man over us, and he's seen that man dismiss him as disposable. Roman's learning lessons about consequences that will serve him well. The workshop phone rang. Julius answered to find Wilson Saunders, his lawyer, with an update on the legal proceedings. Paternity tests confirmed what we already knew, Wilson reported. Brandon Calhoun is the biological father. Candace's parental rights have been terminated per the agreement she signed. Full custody of Roman goes to you, and all marital assets transfer according to the post-nuptial agreement. And the other matters? Brandon's business licenses are suspended pending investigation into fraudulent practices. The IRS has frozen his accounts. Dr. Miranda's medical license has been revoked. Everything's proceeding as you requested. Julius ended the call and turned back to Felix. Brandon's been neutralized financially and professionally. Now we move to the final phase. Felix opened a black case containing items that most people would never recognize. Specialized restraints, chemical compounds, and precision instruments designed for very specific purposes. You understand there's no going back from this point? Brandon Calhoun made his choice when he decided to destroy my family. Now, he gets to live with the consequences of that choice. Briefly, Roman looked up from his equipment. Dad, can I ask something? Always, son. Will Mom try to come back? After? Julius considered the question seriously. Candace was currently staying with her parents, who'd been horrified to learn of her betrayal and the circumstances surrounding the baby's birth. Tommy and Lucia Chung had raised their daughter with traditional values about family loyalty and honor, and her actions had shamed them deeply. Your mother made her choice, Roman. She chose Brandon over us. Lies over truth, destruction over family. People don't come back from choices like that. Good, Roman said simply. She hurt you. She hurt our family. People who do that shouldn't get to come back. Felix studied the boy with professional interest. You're raising a soldier, Julius. I'm raising a little. We protect what's ours, and we punish those who threaten it. Roman's learning early what took me years to understand. That evening, Julius drove to the Riverside Motel to deliver Brandon's invitation to their final meeting. He found the man exactly where Felix had predicted, drunk, disheveled, and wallowing in the ruins of his life. Brandon's room reeked of whiskey and desperation. Julius, Brandon slurred when he opened the door. Come to gloat. Come to offer you a chance to explain yourself before we settle this permanently. Brandon's bloodshot eyes struggled to focus. What do you mean, settle this? I mean, you destroyed my family, Brandon. You seduced my wife, fathered a child while she was married to me, and planned to steal my son. Those actions have consequences. Look, Julius, I know you're angry. Angry. Julius stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. Brandon, angry is what men feel when someone cuts them off in traffic. What I feel about what you've done to my family requires a different word entirely. Brandon stumbled backward, suddenly aware that he was in the presence of something dangerous. What do you want? Money? I'll pay whatever. I want you to understand something about the little family. We don't forgive betrayal, Brandon. We don't forget it. We don't settle it through lawyers or divorce courts. We handle it personally. Julius pulled out his phone and showed Brandon a photograph. Felix Owens loading equipment into his van outside the motel. You're going to come with me tonight, Brandon. You're going to explain to my son why you thought it was acceptable to destroy his family. You're going to apologize for the pain you've caused. And then you're going to face the consequences of your actions. You can't just. I can and I will. Because some betrayals demand more than legal punishment. Some betrayals require justice that the courts are too civilized to provide. Brandon's face went white as the full implications of Julius's words sank in. Julius, please. I have children. So do I. You tried to steal mine. Your children will learn that their father was a man who destroyed families for his own gratification. That's the legacy you chose for them. Julius pulled zip ties from his pocket, industrial-grade restraints that had served him well in various business negotiations where standard contracts weren't sufficient. You can come voluntarily, or Felix can come up here and assist you. Either way, you're coming. The only question is how much dignity you retain in the process. Brandon looked around the motel room as if searching for escape routes, but Julius had positioned himself between the door and his target. The window faced a 3-story drop onto concrete. There was nowhere to run. What are you going to do to me? I'm going to teach you what happens to men who think they can destroy Julius Little's family and walk away. It's a lesson you'll only need once, because you won't be around to forget it. 20 minutes later, Brandon Calhoun was secured in the back of Felix's van, heading toward a workshop where justice would be served with the same precision Julius brought to his metalwork. The tools were ready, the soundproofing was adequate, and Roman was waiting to see what happened to people who hurt their family. The trap had closed completely, and Brandon was about to discover that some mistakes carried consequences that lasted exactly as long as the person who made them. Chapter 6: The Price of Betrayal. The workshop had been transformed into something that would have made Julius's grandfather proud. Military precision met industrial capability, creating an environment where justice could be dispensed without interference from neighbors or authorities. Roman sat on a stool near the workbench, his expression calm as Felix and Julius secured Brandon Calhoun to a steel chair that had been welded to the floor specifically for this purpose. Brandon's eyes darted around the space, taking in details that painted a picture of his immediate future: soundproof walls, drain systems in the concrete floor, tools arranged with surgical precision. He was no longer drunk. Terror had burned the alcohol from his system, leaving him with crystal-clear awareness of his situation. "Julius, please," he whispered, testing the restraints that held him. "This is insane. You can't just—" "I can't what, Brandon?" Julius pulled up a chair and sat facing his prisoner. "I can't hold you accountable for destroying my family. I can't make you face consequences for your actions." "According to who?" Felix moved around the edges of the space, checking equipment and preparing instruments with the methodical care of a craftsman about to begin important work. Roman watched everything with the focused attention of a student learning valuable lessons. "Dad," Roman said quietly, "should I ask him about the plans they made? About taking me away from you?" Julius nodded. "Go ahead, son." Brandon should explain his thinking to the person he was planning to hurt. Roman slid off his stool and approached Brandon with the direct simplicity that only children possess. "Why did you want to take me away from my dad?" Brandon stared at the 6-year-old, struggling to comprehend how he'd arrived at a moment where a child was interrogating him about family destruction. We never meant to hurt you, Roman. Your mother and we just fell in love." "That's a lie," Roman interrupted with matter-of-fact certainty. "Love doesn't hurt families. Love protects them. What you and Mom did wasn't love. It was selfishness." The child's words carried a weight that seemed to crush something inside Brandon. He looked from Roman to Julius, seeing in both faces the same cold judgment. "Roman's right," Julius said. "What you and Candace called love was actually just selfishness and lust. You wanted what you wanted, and you didn't care who got hurt. You didn't care about my marriage, my family, or my son's well-being. You just took what you wanted and made plans to take more. You were going to steal my son and use him as leverage in a custody battle while you and my wife started new life with my money," Julius finished. "We heard your conversation at the hospital, Brandon. We know exactly what you were planning." Felix approached with a small device that looked like a cross between a soldering iron and a medical instrument. "Julius, we should begin. Dawn comes early, and we have disposal considerations." Brandon's breathing became rapid and shallow. "Disposal? Jesus Christ, Julius, you can't be serious about this. It's murder. You'll go to prison. Roman will grow up without a father. Roman will grow up knowing that his father protected their family," Julius corrected. "He'll know that when someone threatens what's ours, we respond with decisive action. He'll learn that justice isn't always delivered by courts and lawyers. This isn't justice, it's revenge. The difference, Roman said in his clear young voice, is that justice makes sure bad people can't hurt anyone else. Revenge just makes them sorry. Dad's doing justice. Julius felt a surge of pride at his son's understanding. The boy grasped concepts that most adults struggled with. The difference between punishment and prevention, between legal consequences and effective ones. Brandon, Julius said, you're going to answer some questions before we proceed. First, did you ever consider what your actions would do to Roman? Yes, but wrong answer. Felix's device made a soft humming sound as it approached Brandon's left hand. Try again. Brandon screamed as the instrument made contact with his fingers, the smell of burning flesh filling the workshop. Roman watched without flinching, absorbing lessons about consequences that would shape his character for life. Did you consider what your actions would do to Roman? Julius repeated. No, Brandon gasped. No, I never thought about him. I only thought about Candace and myself. I'm sorry. Better. Second question. When you and Candace planned to disappear with the baby, what did you intend to do about Roman? We were going to fight for custody. We thought. Felix's device moved to Brandon's right hand, producing another scream that the soundproof walls contained perfectly. What did you intend to do about Roman? Use him. We were going to use him to hurt you financially through child support and custody battles. We were going to make you pay for everything while keeping him away from you as much as possible. Julius nodded approvingly. Honesty. Third question. If you had succeeded in your plans, would you have stopped there, or would you have continued destroying lives whenever it suited your purposes? Brandon looked around the workshop desperately, understanding that his answer would determine how much longer this session lasted. I would have stopped. Julius, I swear. Wrong. Julius stood and nodded to Felix. People like you don't stop, Brandon. You would have continued taking what you wanted from whoever was weak enough to let you. You would have raised my wife's child to think that destroying families was acceptable behavior. You would have made Roman believe that his father was a man who could be victimized without consequences. Felix moved to more sensitive areas, and Brandon's screams echoed off the workshop walls. Roman pulled out a small notebook and began writing, documenting the session with the thoroughness of a good student. What are you writing, son? Julius asked during a pause in the proceedings. A list of what we learned about bad people, Roman replied. So I'll remember how to recognize them when I'm older. Julius reviewed his son's notes, impressed by the analytical thinking they demonstrated. Roman was learning to categorize threats, identify patterns of behavior, and understand the relationship between actions and consequences. These were skills that would serve him well in a world where predators often disguise themselves as ordinary people. The session continued for another hour, with Brandon providing detailed confessions about his plans, his motivations, and his complete disregard for the damage he'd intended to cause. Felix's expertise ensured that every answer was truthful and that Brandon's understanding of consequences was thorough and lasting. Finally, Julius called a halt to the educational portion of the evening. Brandon hung in his restraints, barely conscious but fully aware of his situation. Brandon, Julius said, you destroyed my family for your own gratification. You planned to steal my son and my money. You showed no regard for anyone but yourself. Do you understand why those choices require permanent consequences? Brandon could barely whisper his response. Yes. Good. Roman, do you have any final questions for Mr. Calhoun? Roman approached the broken man in the chair, studying him with clinical interest. Did you think my dad would just let you hurt us? I thought he would use lawyers. I thought he would follow the rules. Whose rules? Roman asked. The rules that let bad people hurt families and then escape? Dad doesn't follow those rules. He follows better ones. Roman returned to his stool, satisfied with the answers he'd received. Julius checked his watch, 4:30 a.m. Dawn was still an hour away, providing sufficient time for final disposal before the ranch became active with morning routines. Felix, Julius said, let's finish this. Roman, would you like to participate in the final lesson? Roman slid off his stool and joined his father beside Brandon's chair. Together, The little family demonstrated to Brandon Calhoun exactly what happened to people who thought they could destroy families without consequences. By sunrise, Brandon had learned his final lesson, and Julius had ensured that his son understood the most important truth of their family legacy. Loyalty was sacred, betrayal was unforgivable, and justice was something you delivered personally when the system was too weak to do it for you. The workshop was cleaned and returned to its normal appearance, ready for another day of legitimate metalwork. Brandon Calhoun's remains would never be found, but his disappearance would serve as a lesson to anyone else who might consider targeting the little family. Roman helped his father prepare breakfast, chatting about school projects and upcoming activities as if the night's work had been just another family bonding experience, which in many ways it had been. Chapter 7. The New Order. 3 months after Brandon Calhoun's disappearance, Pine Ridge had settled into a new rhythm. The official story was that Brandon had fled town in shame after his business collapsed and his wife divorced him, leaving behind debts and unanswered questions. The FBI had conducted a perfunctory investigation, but men like Brandon vanished frequently enough that his case joined thousands of others in unsolved files. Julius stood in his workshop, watching Roman practice with the tools and equipment that had served them so well. At 6 years old, his son displayed a natural aptitude for precision work and an understanding of consequences that would have disturbed most parents. For Julius, it was simply evidence that the little family traits were breeding true. "Dad," Roman said, carefully adjusting a clamp on the workbench. Mrs. Baker asked about Mom again today. She wanted to know when she was coming back from her family emergency. "What did you tell her?" "That Mom had to go away to think about the choices she made, and that some choices change everything forever." Julius nodded approvingly. Roman had developed his own way of explaining complex situations that satisfied adult curiosity without revealing family business. The boy was learning diplomacy alongside more direct problem-solving methods. Candace had indeed gone away, taking her newborn son to live with distant relatives in Oregon. The shame of her exposure had driven her from Montana entirely, and the legal documents she'd signed ensured she would never return to claim any part of the life she destroyed. Her parents, Tommy and Lucia Chung, had disowned her completely after learning the full extent of her betrayal. "How do you feel about Mom being gone?" Julius asked, continuing to test his son's emotional development. Roman considered the question with his characteristic seriousness. "I miss who I thought she was, but I don't miss the person who lied to us and wanted to hurt our family." "Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense, son. That's a very mature way to understand the situation." The workshop door opened, and Felix Owens entered carrying a newspaper and wearing an expression of professional satisfaction. At his age, Felix had seen enough family disputes to appreciate when one was resolved thoroughly and permanently. "Thought you'd want to see this," Felix said, handing Julius the paper. The headline read, "Local Contractor's Disappearance Remains Mystery." The article rehashed the official story about Brandon's financial troubles and shame-driven flight, but the accompanying photo showed something more interesting. Paige Calhoun and her children leaving their house with suitcases, moving to start fresh somewhere else. "She's taking the children back east," Felix reported, "selling everything and changing their names. Smart woman. She knows when to recognize a warning and act on it." Julius studied the photograph of Brandon's family fleeing Montana. Paige had received a very clear message about what happened to people who threatened the little family, and she'd chosen wisdom over curiosity. Her children would grow up without knowing exactly how their father had died, but they would learn that some choices carried permanent consequences. "Will they be safe?" Roman asked, reading over his father's shoulder. "As long as they remember the lesson their father's disappearance taught them," Julius replied. "Some families are off limits. Some men don't forgive or forget. Some consequences are final." Felix pulled up a chair and joined them at the workbench. "Any word from Wilson about the legal cleanup?" "All finished," Julius confirmed. "Candace's parental rights are permanently terminated. Brandon's paternity of the child is legally established, but with him officially missing, the state is handling custody issues. Dr. Miranda, is facing criminal charges for medical fraud. Every loose end is tied up. Roman looked up from the metalworking project he'd been practicing. Dad, what happens if someone else tries to hurt our family? The same thing that happened to Brandon, Julius answered simply. The little family protects its own, Roman. Always have, always will. That's a responsibility you'll carry when you're older. I understand. Roman returned to his work, but Julius could see the wheels turning in his son's mind. The boy was already thinking like a little, identifying potential threats, planning responses, understanding that true security came from the willingness to act decisively when threatened. The phone rang, and Julius answered to find an unexpected caller. Margaret Haley, Candace's sister from Denver. The real one, not the fictional sister Candace had used as an alibi. Julius, I'm calling about Candace. Our parents told me what happened, and I wanted to apologize for my sister's behavior. That's kind of you, Margaret, but unnecessary. Candace made her choices. I know, but I wanted you to understand that what she did doesn't represent our family's values. We were raised better than that. Julius appreciated the gesture, but he'd already moved past the need for external validation. Margaret, your sister chose to destroy our family for temporary gratification. She got exactly what her choices earned her. Nothing more, nothing less. What about the baby? Candace won't tell anyone where Brandon is or how to reach him. Brandon's whereabouts are no longer a concern, Julius said carefully. The baby is being cared for appropriately through proper channels. There was a long pause before Margaret spoke again. Julius, there are rumors, people saying Brandon didn't just leave town voluntarily. People say a lot of things, Margaret. Most of them are just gossip and speculation. But if someone hurt him, if something happened to him because of what he did with Candace. Julius's voice took on the cold precision that Roman had learned to recognize as a warning. Margaret, some questions are better left unasked. Some answers are better left unknown. Brandon Calhoun made choices that carry consequences. Anyone else who makes similar choices will discover similar consequences. The call ended with Margaret understanding exactly what kind of family she'd nearly become related to through her sister's marriage. The little family's reputation was spreading, ensuring that future threats would think twice before targeting them. That evening, Julius and Roman sat on the ranch's front porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. Roman had grown noticeably in the months since his mother's betrayal, not just physically, but in confidence and understanding. He carried himself like a young man who knew his worth and understood his heritage. Dad, Roman said, when I grow up, will I be as strong as you? Stronger, son. You're learning lessons at 6 years old that took me much longer to understand. You're seeing how the world really works, not the fairy tale version most children are taught. What's the most important lesson? Julius considered the question carefully. Roman was ready for truth that most adults couldn't handle, but he was still young enough to absorb it completely. The most important lesson is that family is everything, Roman. Not blood, real family. The people who would sacrifice anything to protect you, and who you would sacrifice anything to protect. Everything else is just convenience and temporary arrangement. Roman nodded solemnly, like how Mom wasn't really family anymore when she chose Brandon over us. Exactly. Real family doesn't betray each other. Real family doesn't plan to hurt each other for personal gain. Real family stands together against threats, no matter what form those threats take. As darkness settled over the ranch, Julius felt a deep satisfaction with the lessons his son was learning. Roman would grow up understanding that the world contained predators who disguised themselves as ordinary people, and that true security came from the willingness to identify and eliminate threats before they could cause damage. The little family legacy was secure in hands that would prove even more capable than those that had come before. And anyone foolish enough to test that legacy would discover, as Brandon Calhoun had discovered, that some families played by rules that ensured their enemies didn't get second chances. Chapter 8. The Final Lesson. 2 years had passed since Brandon Calhoun's disappearance, and Roman Little had grown into a boy who understood the world with unsettling clarity. At 8 years old, He moved through life with the confidence of someone who'd seen consequences delivered personally and knew his family's capacity for protecting what mattered. Julius watched his son practice welding in the workshop, noting how Roman's hands remained steady even when working with dangerous equipment. The boy had inherited more than just the little family's gray eyes. He'd absorbed their understanding of precision, patience, and the absolute necessity of finishing what you started. Perfect bead, Julius observed as Roman completed a joint on a practice piece. Your grandfather would be proud of your technique. Thanks, Dad. Felix says I have good instincts for the work. Felix Owens had become a regular presence at the ranch, ostensibly helping with metalworking projects, but actually serving as Roman's teacher in subjects not covered by traditional education. The boy was learning skills that most people never imagined existed. How to read microexpressions, how to identify weaknesses in people and situations, how to plan operations that left no evidence behind. The workshop phone rang, interrupting their session. Julius answered to find Wilson Saunders with news that would require careful handling. Julius, we have a situation. Candace is back in Montana. Julius felt his blood cool to the temperature that Roman had learned to recognize as dangerous. Where? She's staying at the Pineview Motor Lodge outside town. She's alone, no sign of the child. She's been asking around about you and Roman, claiming she wants to see her son. After 2 years of silence. There's more. She's been talking to people about Brandon's disappearance. She seems to think she knows something about what really happened to him. Julius ended the call and turned to find Roman watching him with alert attention. His son had developed the ability to read situations quickly and accurately, a skill that had proven valuable on multiple occasions. Mom's back, Roman said. It wasn't a question. Yes, she wants to see you. Roman's expression didn't change, but Julius saw the subtle shift in posture that indicated his son was processing threat information. Do I have to see her? What do you think? Roman considered the question with the same analytical approach he brought to welding projects. She made her choice when she left us for Brandon. She doesn't get to change her mind now just because things didn't work out the way she planned. Legally, she has no rights. You belong to me completely, and she's signed documents ensuring that can never change. But she might try to cause problems anyway. What kind of problems? Julius studied his son's face, seeing in it the same cold intelligence that had served their family for generations. Roman was ready for truth that would prepare him for whatever came next. The kind of problems that require permanent solutions. Roman nodded thoughtfully, like Brandon required. Similar situation, similar solution. That evening, Julius drove to the Pineview Motor Lodge to assess the situation personally. He found Candace in a lobby, looking older and worn down by 2 years of consequences. She'd aged more than the time would account for, suggesting that exile hadn't been kind to her. Julius, she said, standing as he approached. Thank you for coming. What do you want, Candace? I want to see Roman. I want to explain things to him, to apologize for the mistakes I made. Julius studied his former wife, noting the desperation in her eyes and the careful way she chose her words. She was fishing for information while trying to appear remorseful. Roman doesn't need explanations from someone who planned to steal him from his father. He's learned everything he needs to know about your character. He's my son, too. No, he's not. You signed away any claim to him when you chose Brandon over your family. Roman is a little now, completely and permanently. Candace's facade cracked slightly, revealing the calculation underneath. Julius, I know what happened to Brandon. I know he didn't just disappear voluntarily. Do you? He would never have left without contacting me. He loved me, and he loved our child. Someone made him disappear. Julius felt the cold satisfaction that came with confirming an enemy's intentions. Candace hadn't returned out of maternal love. She'd come back to cause trouble, possibly hoping to leverage suspicions about Brandon's fate into some kind of advantage. Candace, Brandon Calhoun got exactly what his choices earned him. If you're smart, you'll learn from his example instead of trying to follow it. Are you threatening me? I'm explaining reality. You destroyed our family for temporary gratification. You planned to steal my son and my money. You showed no regard for anyone but yourself. Those choices had consequences, and those consequences are permanent. Julius turned to leave, But Candace's next words stopped him cold. I've told people what I suspect about Brandon. If something happens to me, they'll know who to look at first. Julius turned back slowly, his expression carrying the kind of finality that had preceded Brandon's last lesson. Candace, threatening me or my family was the last mistake Brandon ever made. Are you sure you want to repeat his error? The fear in her eyes confirmed that she understood exactly what she was dealing with, but desperation had driven her past the point of wisdom. She was going to force a confrontation, which meant she was going to require the same kind of permanent education that had solved the Brandon problem. I want to see my son, she repeated, but her voice now carried the tremor of someone who knew she was standing on very thin ice. You lost the right to call him that when you chose betrayal over family. Roman understands what kind of person you really are, Candace. He's not interested in seeing you. Julius left her standing in the motel lobby, but he knew this wasn't over. Candace had returned with an agenda that went beyond maternal instincts, and she'd essentially declared war on his family by threatening to cause problems about Brandon's disappearance. Driving home, Julius made mental preparations for another educational session in his workshop. Some people learned from other people's examples. Some people required personal instruction. Candace had just identified herself as the latter type. At the ranch, he found Roman waiting in the workshop, having apparently anticipated what the evening's discussion would require. She's not going away quietly, is she? Roman asked. No, son. She's going to force a confrontation. What do we do? Julius looked at his 8-year-old son, seeing in him not a child who needed protection from harsh realities, but a young partner who understood family loyalty and the price of betrayal. We solve the problem the same way we've always solved problems that threaten our family. Permanently and completely. Roman nodded with the composure of someone who'd learned early that some situations required decisive action. When? Soon. But first, she needs to understand exactly what she's walked into. Some lessons are more effective when the student has time to anticipate them. Julius began making preparations for Candace's final education, knowing that this time Roman would play a more active role in the proceedings. His son was ready to learn the most advanced lessons the little family had to teach about consequences, loyalty, and the price of threatening those you should have protected. The workshop would soon serve its specialized purpose once again, ensuring that the little family legacy remained secure from all threats, internal and external alike. Chapter 9. Blood and Legacy. The trap was set with the same precision Julius brought to all his work. Candace received a message claiming to be from Roman, asking to meet her at the old barn on the outskirts of the little property. The message expressed a young boy's confusion about his mother's return and his desire to understand why she'd left him. Julius and Roman waited in the barn as evening shadows grew long across the Montana landscape. Roman, now 8 years old, sat calmly on a hay bale, checking equipment with the methodical care his father had taught him. The boy had grown into his role as Julius's partner in family protection, understanding that some threats required permanent solutions. Dad, Roman said quietly, why did she come back? She had to know what would happen. Desperation makes people stupid, son. She probably thought enough time had passed that we'd forgotten what she did to our family. We don't forget. No, we don't. That's what separates us from people like your mother and Brandon. They think consequences have expiration dates. We know better. Headlights swept across the barn entrance as Candace's rental car approached. Julius motioned for Roman to take his position behind the equipment they'd prepared, then stepped into the shadows himself. Everything that followed needed to appear to be Candace's choice, right up until the moment choice was no longer an option. Candace entered the barn cautiously, calling out in a voice that tried to project maternal concern. Roman? Honey, are you here? It's Mommy. Roman stepped into the light, and Julius felt a surge of pride at his son's composure. The boy showed no signs of nervousness or emotional conflict, only the cold focus that served the little family so well. Hello, Candace, Roman said, deliberately avoiding the word mother. Roman, oh sweetheart, I've missed you so much. Candace moved toward him, but Roman stepped back, maintaining distance. I got your message. You said you wanted to explain why you left us. I did, honey. I made terrible mistakes, and I want to make things right. I want us to be a family again. Roman tilted his head, studying her with analytical interest. What about Brandon? What about the baby that wasn't Dad's? Candace flinched at the directness of the question. She'd apparently forgotten how perceptive Roman had always been, how little escaped his attention. Those were mistakes, Roman. I was confused and unhappy, and I made bad choices. But I've learned from them. I want to come home. You can't come home, Roman said simply. This isn't your home anymore. You chose Brandon and his baby over Dad and me. That choice meant you weren't family anymore. Roman, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. You lied to us. You planned to steal me from Dad. You wanted to hurt our family for your own benefit. Those aren't mistakes, they're betrayals. Julius watched from the shadows as his son delivered lessons about family loyalty that cut deeper than any physical weapon. Roman had learned to use words as precisely as any tool in the workshop. Where's your father? Candace asked, finally recognizing that this meeting wasn't going as she'd planned. He's here, Roman replied. He's always here when someone threatens our family. Julius stepped into the light, and Candace's face went pale as she realized she'd walked into exactly the kind of trap that had claimed Brandon Calhoun. Hello, Candace. I believe you wanted to discuss Brandon's disappearance. Julius, I just wanted to see Roman. I never meant. You meant to threaten my family with suspicions about Brandon's fate. You meant to use those threats to force your way back into a life you'd already destroyed. You meant to hurt us again, just like you did before. Candace backed toward the barn entrance, but Roman had quietly moved to block her escape route. She was trapped between father and son, with nowhere to run and no one to call for help. Please, she whispered. I'll leave. I'll go back to Oregon and never contact you again. I promise. Your promises aren't worth much, Roman observed. You promised to love and honor Dad when you married him. You promised you'd never hurt our family. You promised the baby was his. Why should we believe you now? Julius pulled restraints from behind a hay bale, the same industrial zip ties that had served him so well with Brandon. Candace, you had 2 years to stay away and leave us alone. Instead, you chose to come back and threaten us. That choice has consequences. You can't do this. People know I'm here. If I disappear, people will assume you left town the same way Brandon did. Julius interrupted. Shame has a way of making people run from their problems. Roman approached Candace with the confidence of someone who'd participated in this process before. Candace, you tried to destroy our family. You planned to steal me from Dad. You came back to hurt us again. Do you understand why those choices require permanent consequences? The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour, with Candace providing detailed confessions about her motivations, her complete disregard for the damage she'd intended to cause, and her lack of genuine remorse for the betrayal she'd committed. Roman took careful notes, documenting the session with the thoroughness his father had taught him. Felix Owens arrived as planned, bringing specialized equipment and decades of expertise in solving family problems permanently. Roman watched the proceedings with the focused attention of an advanced student, absorbing lessons that would serve him well when he inherited full responsibility for protecting the little family legacy. Dad, Roman said during a brief pause in Candace's education, she really thought she could come back and hurt us without consequences. Some people never learn, son. That's why permanent solutions are sometimes necessary. As dawn approached, Julius and Roman completed the final lesson in family loyalty and the price of betrayal. Candace had learned exactly what happened to people who threatened the little family, joining Brandon in whatever afterlife awaited those who chose selfishness over honor. The barn was cleaned and returned to its normal appearance, ready for legitimate agricultural use. Candace's rental car was disposed of through channels that would leave no trace, and her disappearance would be explained by the same shame and desperation that had supposedly driven Brandon away. Later that morning, Julius and Roman sat at their kitchen table, sharing breakfast and discussing plans for the day. Roman had school, Julius had legitimate business to conduct, and life would continue with the peaceful rhythm that came from having eliminated threats to family security. Dad, Roman said over his cereal. "Do you think anyone else would try to hurt our family?" "Probably, son. The world is full of people who think they can take what isn't theirs and hurt people who can't defend themselves. What happens when they try?" Julius smiled, seeing in his 8-year-old son the future guardian of everything the little family had built. They learned the same lessons that Brandon and your mother learned. The little family protects its own, Roman. Always have, always will. Roman nodded with the satisfaction of someone who understood his place in a legacy that stretched back generations and would continue long into the future. He learned that family meant more than blood, that loyalty was earned through actions, and that some betrayals required consequences that courts and lawyers were too civilized to provide. As Julius drove Roman to school that morning, he reflected on the lessons his son had absorbed over the past 2 years. The boy understood concepts that most adults never grasped: the relationship between actions and consequences, the importance of finishing what you started, and the absolute necessity of protecting those who earned your loyalty. Roman would grow up knowing how to identify threats before they could cause damage, how to respond to betrayal with appropriate force, and how to ensure that the little family legacy remained secure for future generations. He would never be the victim that his father had almost become, never trust blindly, never forgive those who proved themselves unworthy of mercy. At the school drop-off, Roman gathered his backpack and homework with the same methodical care he brought to more serious family business. "Have a good day at school, son." "Thanks, Dad. See you tonight." Julius watched his boy walk into the building, carrying himself with the confidence of someone who knew his worth and understood his heritage. Roman little would face the world with tools and knowledge that would serve him well, no matter what challenges arose. The little family legacy was secure in hands that would prove even more capable than those that had come before. And anyone foolish enough to test that legacy would discover, as Brandon and Candace had discovered, that some families played by rules that ensured their enemies didn't survive to threaten them twice. Justice had been served, family honor had been preserved, and the next generation was prepared to carry forward traditions that had kept the little family strong for generations. In a world full of predators and betrayers, that was the only security that truly mattered. The truck pulled away from the school, carrying Julius' little back to his ranch, his workshop, and his life of building things that lasted, including the character of a son who would never make the mistake of trusting those who hadn't earned it, or forgiving those who chose betrayal over loyalty. Some lessons were worth any price to teach properly, and Julius had ensured that another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen, and I'll see you there. Welcome back to another episode of Infidelity Tales Lab. We're thankful for your continued viewership. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love knowing our global reach. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, The Arrival. Vincent Murphy stood at the window of his modest 2-story house, watching the social worker's car disappear down Maple Street. In the silence that followed, he could hear the soft whimpering from the living room where 8-year-old Tommy sat clutching a worn teddy bear, his only remaining possession from a life that had been shattered 2 weeks ago. Vince had built his reputation as a security consultant through 15 years of methodical precision, first in the Army and then in the private sector. At 42, his weathered face and calculating gray eyes reflected a man who solved problems with surgical efficiency. But standing there, looking at his deceased brother's son, he felt something crack inside his chest. "Hey there, soldier," Vince said, using the nickname he'd given Tommy during their infrequent visits. The boy looked up with red-rimmed eyes that reminded Vince painfully of his brother Mike. "You remember Aunt Patty?" Patricia Murphy emerged from the kitchen, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing the pale blue scrubs that marked her profession as a registered nurse. At 38, she possessed the kind of understated beauty that had first caught Vince's attention 12 years ago at a Veterans Hospital charity event. She'd been volunteering there, he'd been recovering from shrapnel wounds, and their courtship had been built on her gentle care and his grateful devotion. "Of course he remembers me," Patty said, settling beside Tommy with practiced ease. "We're going to take real good care of you, sweetheart. Your Uncle Vince has to travel for work sometimes, but I'll be right here. I work nights at the hospital, so we'll have lots of time together during the day." Tommy nodded silently, and Vince felt that familiar surge of gratitude for his wife's nurturing nature. They'd never been able to have children of their own, a source of quiet grief that had only strengthened their bond. Now, fate had given them a chance to be parents, albeit under the most tragic circumstances. "I've already talked to Mrs. Henderson next door," Patty continued, her voice soft and reassuring. "She's retired and loves children. She'll check on you when I'm at work, and she's got emergency contacts for both your uncle and me." Over the next few days, Vince watched his wife transform their spare bedroom into a child's sanctuary. She painted the walls a cheerful blue, assembled a race car bed, and filled the shelves with toys and books. Her dedication reminded him why he'd fallen in love with her, the way she threw herself completely into caring for others. But as the first week passed, Vince began noticing changes in Tommy that troubled him. The boy, who had been eating ravenously during his first days with them, perhaps making up for the chaos of the past month, began picking at his food. He complained of stomach aches and seemed constantly tired, napping far more than seemed normal for an active 8-year-old. "Maybe it's the stress," Patty suggested when Vince expressed concern. "He's been through tremendous trauma. Children process grief differently than adults. Give him time." Vince wanted to believe her. As someone who'd witnessed the effects of trauma firsthand, he understood that grief could manifest in unexpected ways. But his training in threat assessment made him naturally suspicious of coincidences. Tommy had been healthy during the brief time they'd cared for him immediately after the funeral. The decline had begun only after they'd settled into a routine. "I think we should take him to a doctor," Vince said one evening as they watched Tommy struggle to finish half a sandwich. "I am a medical professional, honey," Patty replied, though not unkindly. "I've been monitoring his symptoms. He doesn't have a fever, his color is good, and he's still gaining weight overall. Sometimes children's appetites fluctuate when they're adjusting to new environments." Still, something gnawed at Vince's instincts. He'd learned in the military never to ignore that persistent voice that whispered warnings. Too many good soldiers had died because someone had dismissed their gut feelings as paranoia. That weekend, while Patty worked a double shift at the hospital, Vince spent quality time with Tommy, taking him to the local park and arcade. Away from the house, the boy seemed to perk up significantly. His energy returned. He laughed at Vince's terrible jokes, and he devoured an entire pizza at lunch. "I like it better when it's just us," Tommy said unexpectedly as they walked home. "Aunt Patty is nice, but she makes me feel sleepy." The comment hit Vince like a cold blade between the ribs. He knelt down to Tommy's level, studying the boy's face carefully. "What do you mean, sleepy?" "After she gives me my vitamins," Tommy explained matter-of-factly. "She says they're special ones to help me grow big and strong like you, but they make me want to take naps all the time." Vince's blood pressure spiked. Neither he nor Patty had discussed vitamins for Tommy. As far as he knew, the boy was taking no medications at all. "Tommy," he said carefully, "can you show me these vitamins when we get home?" But when they returned to the house, Patty was already there, having left work early with a headache. She greeted them with warm hugs and immediately began preparing Tommy's afternoon snack, a routine that Vince now realized he'd never actually witnessed. That night, as Patty slept beside him, Vince stared at the ceiling and made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, he would install a security camera in the kitchen. He told himself it was just to put his mind at ease, to prove that his suspicious nature was getting the better of him. He had no idea that the footage he was about to capture would reveal a betrayal so profound that it would transform him from a protective husband into something far more dangerous. Chapter 2. The Hidden Truth. Vince spent Monday morning at his office, ostensibly reviewing security protocols for a new client, but actually researching the most sophisticated surveillance equipment money could buy. His company, Murphy Security Consulting, specialized in corporate espionage prevention, which meant he had access to military-grade technology that most people couldn't even imagine. He selected a pinhole camera system so advanced that it could record in 4K resolution while being virtually undetectable. The lens was smaller than a pencil eraser and could be hidden inside something as innocuous as a smoke detector. More importantly, it transmitted directly to his encrypted server, meaning he could monitor the feed remotely from his phone. By Tuesday afternoon, the system was installed and operational. Vince had positioned cameras in the kitchen, living room, and Tommy's bedroom, telling himself that he was simply being thorough. If Tommy was having some kind of medical episode, the footage might help doctors identify patterns they couldn't see otherwise. The first day's recordings showed nothing unusual. Patty prepared Tommy's breakfast and lunch with her typical care, helped him with homework, and read him stories before his nap. Vince felt foolish for suspecting his wife of what exactly? He wasn't even sure what he'd been afraid of finding. But on Thursday morning, everything changed. Vince was in a client meeting when his phone buzzed with a motion alert from the kitchen camera. He glanced at it absently, expecting to see Patty preparing lunch. Instead, he watched his wife remove a small brown bottle from her purse and carefully measure several drops of clear liquid into Tommy's orange juice. The bottle was unmarked, and Patty handled it with the kind of careful precision she used when administering medications at the hospital. But Tommy wasn't supposed to be on any medications. Vince had specifically asked about this during their conversations with the social worker. His hands shaking slightly, Vince excused himself from the meeting and found a private office where he could review the footage more carefully. He watched his wife stir the doctored juice, then called Tommy in for lunch. The boy drank it obediently, and within 20 minutes, he was struggling to keep his eyes open. "Just a little nap, sweetheart." Patty's voice came through clearly on the audio. "You'll feel better when you wake up." Vince's military training kicked in, suppressing the emotional turmoil and focusing his mind on intelligence gathering. He needed more information before he could act. Whatever Patty was doing, she was being careful and methodical about it. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a pattern. Over the next week, Vince documented everything. Patty administered the unknown substance daily, always when she thought she was unobserved. Sometimes it went into Tommy's juice, sometimes into his soup, and once into a glass of chocolate milk. The dosage seemed carefully calculated, enough to make the boy drowsy and lethargic, but not enough to cause obvious symptoms that would trigger a hospital visit. But the most disturbing discovery came on the following Tuesday. Vince was reviewing footage from the previous evening when he caught something that made his blood freeze. After putting Tommy to bed, Patty had made a phone call. "It's working perfectly," she said, her voice low but clear on the recording. "He's weak and tired all the time now, but not sick enough to arouse suspicion. Vince thinks it's just grief and adjustment." There was a pause as she listened to whoever was on the other end. "I know we have to be patient," she continued, "but the policy is substantial, and I've been very careful about the documentation. A child his age, with the trauma he's experienced, when it happens, it'll look completely natural." Vince felt the room spinning around him. Policy? Documentation? His wife was talking about Tommy, as if he were some kind of investment. "Yes, I miss you too," Patty said, her voice taking on a different tone entirely. "But we can't risk Vince getting suspicious. He's trained to notice things, and he's already asking questions about Tommy's health. We just need a few more weeks, and then we can be together properly." The call ended, and Vince watched his wife check her appearance in the hallway mirror before climbing the stairs to their bedroom, where she would lie down next to him and pretend to be the loving, caring woman he'd married. Vince sat in his office until dawn, reviewing the footage again and again, trying to find some alternative explanation for what he'd witnessed. But the evidence was undeniable. His wife was slowly poisoning his nephew, and she had an accomplice, someone she was romantically involved with, someone who was helping her plan whatever natural death they had in mind for Tommy. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound he'd ever received. But beneath the pain, something else was growing, something cold and calculating and infinitely dangerous. Vince had spent his entire adult life protecting people from threats. Now he discovered that the greatest threat to his family was living under his own roof. As the sun rose over Maple Street, Vince began planning his response. He would not simply confront Patty or turn her over to the police. That would be too clean, too merciful for someone who had violated every sacred trust. Patty and her accomplice wanted to play games with innocent lives? Then Vince would show them what it meant to be a player in a game where the stakes were life and death, and where he held all the cards. Chapter 3. The Investigation. Vince spent the weekend in his basement workshop, ostensibly organizing his tools while actually planning the most important operation of his life. Above him, he could hear Patty reading Tommy bedtime stories, her voice soft and caring, the same voice that had coldly discussed the boy's natural death just days earlier. Monday morning, Vince implemented the first phase of his investigation. While Patty slept after her night shift, he carefully extracted a sample of the clear liquid from the bottle in her purse, using a syringe to draw out exactly 2 milliliters. His friend, Dr. Morgan Griffin, a toxicologist at the state lab, owed him several favors from Vince's military days. "I need this analyzed," Vince said, handing over the sealed vial during their lunch meeting. "Full spectrum, and I need the results kept completely confidential." Griffin, a thin man with prematurely gray hair, studied the sample with professional interest. "What am I looking for?" "Something that would cause fatigue, lethargy, and gradually declining health in a child. Something that wouldn't show up in a routine blood panel, but might cause organ failure over time." Griffin's expression darkened. "Vince, if this is what I think it is." "I need confirmation first," Vince interrupted. 48 hours? 24, Griffin promised. "And Vince? If this is what we both suspect, you better be ready to move fast." While waiting for the lab results, Vince focused on identifying Patty's accomplice. The phone number she called was registered to a prepaid account, but Vince had resources that went beyond normal civilian capabilities. A contact at the telecommunications company owed him a favor from a corporate espionage case, and by Wednesday afternoon, Vince had a location history for the phone. The pattern was revealing. The phone spent most of its time at an address in Riverside Heights, an upscale neighborhood 15 minutes from their home. Property records showed the house belonged to Dale Riverside, a 45-year-old insurance investigator who worked for Pinnacle Life Insurance Company. Insurance. Suddenly, pieces of the puzzle began clicking into place with sickening clarity. Vince spent Wednesday evening conducting surveillance on Riverside's house, using skills honed during countless military operations. The man himself was unremarkable. Average height, thinning brown hair, the soft physique of someone who spent his days behind a desk. But when Patty's car pulled into his driveway at 11:30 p.m., Vince felt the final piece of the puzzle slide into place. Through his telephoto lens, he watched his wife of 12 years kiss another man with a passion she hadn't shown him in months. They stood in Riverside's living room window, silhouetted against the light, and Vince could see Patty gesturing animatedly as she spoke. Even from a distance, her body language conveyed excitement, anticipation, the demeanor of someone discussing a plan nearing completion. Thursday morning brought confirmation from Griffin. "It's insulin," the toxicologist reported grimly. "High-grade pharmaceutical insulin in a non-diabetic child. Regular doses would cause exactly the symptoms you described. Lethargy, confusion, gradual organ stress. If the doses were increased over time, it would look like organ failure," Vince finished. Natural causes. The beauty of it from a murder standpoint is that insulin breaks down quickly in the body. Unless someone knew exactly what to test for within hours of administration, it would never be detected in an autopsy. Vince thanked Griffin and immediately began the next phase of his investigation. Using his security company's resources, he accessed Tommy's records with the state's social services department. What he found there made his hands clench into fists. 3 weeks before Mike and his wife had died in their car accident, someone had taken out a $500,000 life insurance policy on Tommy. The beneficiary was listed as Patricia Murphy, his legal guardian. The policy had been purchased through Pinnacle Life Insurance Company, and the investigating agent who had approved the application was Dale Riverside. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. Patty and Riverside hadn't simply stumbled into an affair. They had planned Tommy's murder before the boy had even come to live with them. They had been waiting for Mike and Linda to die, positioning themselves to profit from an 8-year-old's death. But there was more. Digging deeper into the insurance records, Vince discovered that the policy had specific clauses that would double the payout if Tommy died within the first year due to natural causes related to psychological trauma. Patty in Riverside had crafted the perfect crime: a grieving child slowly dying from the stress of losing his parents, while his caring aunt documented every symptom for the insurance company. That evening, Vince sat in his study and began planning their destruction. He had considered simply killing them both. It would be easy enough to arrange accidents, and his military training had certainly prepared him for such actions. But death would be too quick, too merciful for what they had done. Instead, Vince decided to give them exactly what they wanted: Tommy's death. But the reality would be very different from their carefully crafted plan. He opened his laptop and began researching something that would have terrified Patty and Riverside if they'd known. Vincent Murphy had spent 2 years in Army intelligence, specializing in deep cover operations and psychological warfare. He knew how to make people destroy themselves, how to turn their own weapons against them, how to create scenarios where his enemies would beg for the mercy they denied others. Patty and Riverside thought they were playing a game with an innocent child's life. They had no idea they were about to become players in a much more dangerous game, one where Vince held all the cards, and where the only possible outcome was their complete annihilation. As he began drafting the first phase of his plan, Vince allowed himself a cold smile. By the time he was finished, Patty and Riverside would understand exactly what it felt like to be helpless, trapped, and slowly dying while someone they trusted watched without mercy. The game was about to begin. Chapter 4: The Architect of Vengeance. Friday morning, Vince called in sick to work, the first time he'd done so in 3 years. Instead of heading to his office, he drove to a storage unit facility across town, where he kept equipment that most security consultants would never need. The unit contained surveillance gear acquired through military surplus channels, communication equipment that operated on encrypted frequencies, and other tools that existed in the gray areas between civilian and military applications. More importantly, it contained detailed files on psychological operations techniques he'd learned during his time in Army intelligence. Vince had always been thorough in his record-keeping, and now that methodical nature would serve him well. He spent the morning reviewing case studies in psychological manipulation, focusing specifically on operations designed to make targets destroy themselves. The key, he remembered from his training, was to create scenarios where the enemy's own actions led to their downfall. It wasn't enough to simply defeat them. They had to be made to defeat themselves. By noon, Vince had outlined a plan that would systematically dismantle Patty and Riverside's lives while giving them the illusion that they were succeeding. Phase 1 would begin immediately. That afternoon, while Patty was at work, Vince made several calls from untraceable phones. The first was to Pinnacle Life Insurance Company's Fraud Investigation Department. "I'd like to report suspicious activity regarding a life insurance policy," he told the investigator, disguising his voice with techniques learned in covert operations. "Policy number 7749 Alpha Delta on a minor named Thomas Murphy. The beneficiary appears to be administering unauthorized substances to the insured party." The investigator asked for details, and Vince provided just enough information to trigger an internal investigation without revealing his own involvement. Insurance companies, he knew, took fraud extremely seriously, especially when it involved the death of a child. His second call was to the state medical board's anonymous tip line. "I want to report a registered nurse who appears to be administering unprescribed medications to a child in her care. The nurse is Patricia Murphy, license number." He provided Patty's license information from memory, along with carefully worded descriptions of what he'd observed. The third call was to Dale Riverside's supervisor at Pinnacle Life Insurance. Using a different voice disguise, Vince reported concerns about an investigator who might be approving fraudulent policies. He provided specific details about the timing of Tommy's policy and Riverside's role in its approval. Each call was designed to plant seeds of suspicion that would grow slowly, creating pressure on both Patty and Riverside without revealing the source of the investigation. They would assume it was random bad luck, never suspecting that their victim's guardian was orchestrating their downfall. That evening, Vince began implementing phase 2 of his plan. He needed Tommy to appear to decline more rapidly, but without actually harming the boy. The solution came from his medical contacts. A pharmacist friend owed him a favor and was willing to provide theatrical blood capsules and other harmless substances that could simulate serious symptoms. Over the weekend, while Patty worked her night shifts, Vince taught Tommy a game. "We're going to play a trick on Aunt Patty," he explained. "When she gives you your vitamins, I want you to bite down on this." He showed the boy the blood capsules. "It'll make fake blood come out of your mouth, like in the movies. Then you pretend to feel sick, and I'll come running. It's our secret game, okay?" Tommy, delighted to be included in what seemed like an elaborate prank, agreed enthusiastically. Vince felt a twinge of guilt at involving the boy, but reminded himself that Tommy was already being poisoned. This way, at least, the child would be protected while appearing to deteriorate. Monday morning brought the first fruits of Vince's psychological warfare. Patty received a call from the state medical board requesting an interview regarding her nursing practices. She handled it well, maintaining her composure, but Vince could see the stress in the way her hands shook as she hung up the phone. "What was that about?" he asked, feigning casual concern. "Just routine stuff," Patty replied, but her voice was slightly higher than normal. "Sometimes they do random audits of nurses who work with children. Nothing to worry about." That afternoon, while Patty was administering Tommy's vitamins, the boy bit down on the blood capsule as instructed. The effect was dramatic. Blood appeared to pour from his mouth as he collapsed, apparently unconscious. Patty's scream brought Vince running from his study. He found his wife kneeling beside Tommy, her face white with panic. "I don't know what happened," she gasped. "He was fine 1 second, and then—" Vince quickly determined that Tommy was breathing normally and his pulse was strong. The blood was already beginning to fade as the theatrical formula broke down. "We need to get him to the hospital," he announced. But as they prepared to leave, Tommy regained consciousness, claiming he felt fine except for a strange taste in his mouth. Vince insisted on a hospital visit anyway. Where the emergency room, doctors found nothing wrong, exactly as Vince had expected. The incident served multiple purposes. It escalated the apparent severity of Tommy's condition, which would accelerate whatever timeline Patty and Riverside were working with. More importantly, it created medical documentation of Tommy's deteriorating health, which would be crucial for the later phases of Vince's plan. That evening, Patty made another call to Riverside. "Something's happening faster than we expected," she said, her voice tight with stress. "Maybe we should reconsider the timeline." "Stay calm." Riverside's voice came through clearly on Vince's surveillance equipment. "These things happen with insulin. The body can become more sensitive over time. If anything, this confirms that our approach is working." But what if Vince gets suspicious? He's already asking more questions about Tommy's health. Then we accelerate the plan. Another few weeks at most. The policy will pay out, and we can disappear together like we planned. Vince allowed himself a cold smile as he listened to their conversation. They thought they were adapting to unexpected complications, but they were actually dancing to his choreography. Every move they made brought them deeper into his trap. Phase 3 of his plan would begin tomorrow, and by the time it was complete, Patty and Riverside would find themselves in a position where their only choice would be to destroy each other. The puppet master was ready to make his pieces dance. Chapter 5. The Trap Tightens. Tuesday morning, Vince received a call that marked the beginning of his enemy's unraveling. The caller identified himself as Agent Reynolds from Pinnacle Life Insurance's Fraud Investigation Unit. "Mr. Murphy, we've received some concerning information about your nephew's insurance policy. Would it be possible for us to schedule a meeting?" Vince feigned confusion perfectly. "I wasn't aware Tommy had an insurance policy. My wife handles most of the paperwork related to his care." "I see. Would it be possible to speak with both of you together? Perhaps this afternoon?" Vince agreed to a 3 p.m. meeting, then immediately called Patty at the hospital. "Honey, we need to talk about Tommy's insurance. Someone from the company wants to meet with us today." The silence on the other end was telling. When Patty finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. "I don't understand. What kind of meeting?" "Something about the policy you took out on him. I didn't even know you'd done that. It's just standard protection, Vincent. given what happened to his parents. I thought it was responsible to make sure he'd be taken care of if anything happened to him while he's in our custody. It was a reasonable explanation, but Vince could hear the stress underneath her words. I'll pick you up at 2:30, he said. We'll handle this together. The meeting took place in the sterile conference room of Pinnacle Life Insurance. Agent Reynolds was a professional-looking woman in her 40s who laid out the situation with clinical precision. We've received allegations that the insured party may be receiving unauthorized medical treatments, she explained. As part of our investigation, we'll need to interview both of you separately, and we may require an independent medical examination of the child. Patty maintained her composure admirably, explaining her nursing background and her concern for Tommy's well-being. But Vince, trained to read micro-expressions and stress indicators, could see the fear in her eyes. More importantly, Agent Reynolds' questions revealed that someone had provided very specific information about the timing of the policy, the amounts involved, and the relationship between the beneficiary and the investigator who had approved it. Vince's anonymous tips were bearing fruit. After the meeting, Patty was quiet during the drive home. Vincent, she finally said, I need to tell you something about Dale Riverside. Vince's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice neutral. Who's Dale Riverside? He's the investigator who handled Tommy's policy. I knew him before. We worked together briefly at the hospital a few years ago, before he moved to insurance. When I applied for the policy, I mentioned that we'd work together, and he expedited the process. It was a masterful half-truth, acknowledging their connection while concealing its true nature. Should I be worried about a conflict of interest? Vince asked. No, it's nothing like that. But with this investigation, I'm worried they might try to make something out of our professional relationship. That evening, Vince watched through his surveillance system as Patty made an emergency call to Riverside. Her end of the conversation was frantic. They know about us. Not about us, but they know we have a connection. Someone's been feeding them information. Riverside's response, captured through sophisticated audio enhancement, was equally stressed. Who could know? We've been careful about everything. I don't know, but this can't be coincidence. First the medical board, now this. Someone's watching us. Maybe we should abort. Disappear before this gets worse. With what money? Patty snapped. We've invested everything in this plan. If we run now, we'll have nothing. Better nothing than prison. Just let me think. Maybe there's still a way to salvage this. Vince smiled as he listened to their growing panic. Phase 4 of his plan would push them past the breaking point. Wednesday morning, Vince made another series of untraceable calls. The first was to the Drug Enforcement Administration's tip line, reporting suspicious acquisition of pharmaceutical-grade insulin by a nurse with access to hospital supplies. The second was to Riverside's ex-wife, a piece of information Vince had uncovered during his background research. Mrs. Riverside, this is Detective Johnson with the Insurance Fraud Unit. We're investigating your ex-husband's activities at Pinnacle Life Insurance. I wonder if we could discuss his financial situation during your divorce proceedings? The woman was eager to cooperate, apparently harboring significant resentment toward her ex-husband. She provided details about hidden assets, falsified financial statements during their divorce, and Dale's history of cutting ethical corners to close deals. By afternoon, both Patty and Riverside were receiving calls from multiple agencies. The pressure was mounting exponentially, and their carefully constructed plan was collapsing around them. That evening, Tommy performed his blood capsule trick again, this time during dinner. The timing was perfect. Patty had just administered his vitamins when he suddenly clutched his stomach and blood began pouring from his mouth. This time, Vince called 911. The ambulance ride to the hospital was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Vince sat in the back with Tommy, holding his hand while the boy continued his performance, all while watching Patty's face crumble with each passing minute. At the hospital, emergency room doctors ran extensive tests while Vince maintained his role as the concerned guardian. Dr. Sarah Chun, the attending physician, pulled him aside for a private conversation. Mr. Murphy, I need to ask you some difficult questions. Has Tommy been in contact with any medications that you're aware of? Specifically, has anyone been giving him anything that wasn't prescribed? Vince's heart rate accelerated, but not from fear, from anticipation. What kind of medications? We found trace amounts of insulin in his blood work. In a non-diabetic child, that's extremely concerning. Insulin in the wrong dosage can cause exactly the symptoms you've described: lethargy, confusion, and in extreme cases, seizures or coma. Insulin? How would he get insulin? Dr. Chin's expression was grave. That's what we need to determine. I'm required to report this to Child Protective Services and the police. Someone has been administering insulin to your nephew, and at this point, we have to consider it attempted murder. As if on cue, Patty appeared in the hallway outside the consultation room. Through the glass window, Vince could see her face go white as she overheard Dr. Chen's words. The trap had snapped shut. In a few hours, police would be asking questions that Patty couldn't answer without implicating herself. Her only choice would be to throw Riverside under the bus, claiming he had somehow coerced her into the scheme. But Vince had anticipated that move. Phase 5 of his plan would ensure that when Patty tried to betray her partner, she would find that Riverside had already betrayed her. The final act of their destruction was about to begin. Chapter 6: The Betrayal. Thursday morning brought chaos to the Murphy household. 2 detectives arrived at 7 a.m., followed by a Child Protective Services investigator, followed by Agent Reynolds from the insurance company. Tommy, coached by Vince, played his part perfectly. A confused, frightened child who didn't understand why adults were asking so many questions. Patty handled the initial questioning with admirable composure, maintaining her story about Tommy's declining health being related to grief and trauma. But when Detective Morrison, a sharp-eyed woman with 20 years of experience, began asking specific questions about insulin, Patty's facade began to crack. Mrs. Murphy, as a registered nurse, you have access to pharmaceutical-grade insulin at the hospital where you work. Is that correct? Yes, but I would never. I've never taken anything from the hospital. Everything is strictly monitored. We're not suggesting you stole anything, Detective Morrison said calmly. But insulin can be obtained through legitimate prescriptions, even for non-diabetic patients, if someone knows how to work the system. Vince watched his wife's face carefully, noting the micro-expressions that revealed her growing panic. She was beginning to realize that her medical knowledge, which she'd thought would protect her, was actually incriminating her. The interview continued for 2 hours, with the detectives asking increasingly specific questions about Tommy's daily routine, his diet, and who had access to his food and drinks. By the end, Patty was visibly shaken. After the police left, Vince found his wife sitting at the kitchen table, staring at her hands. "This is insane," she said. "They think I'm poisoning Tommy. My own nephew." "I know, honey," Vince replied, playing his role perfectly. "But the truth will come out. If someone's been giving him insulin, they'll find out who. What if they don't believe me? What if they think my medical background makes me the obvious suspect?" Vince sat beside her, taking her hands in his. "Patty, is there anything you haven't told me? Anything at all? Because now is the time to be completely honest." For a moment, he thought she might confess everything. Her face went through a series of emotions: fear, guilt, calculation. But in the end, her survival instincts won out. "No," she said firmly. "There's nothing to tell. I've done everything I can to help Tommy recover from his trauma." Meanwhile, across town, Dale Riverside was having his own crisis. Vince's carefully orchestrated pressure campaign had triggered multiple investigations, and Riverside's supervisor had placed him on administrative leave pending a full review of his recent cases. That afternoon, Vince received a call that confirmed his enemies were beginning to turn on each other. The caller was Riverside, though the man didn't know he was speaking to his target. "Mr. Murphy? This is Dale Riverside from Pinnacle Life Insurance. I need to speak with you urgently about your nephew's policy." "Of course," Vince replied. "How can I help? I think there may be some information about your wife that you need to know. Information that could be relevant to the current investigation." They arranged to meet at a coffee shop downtown, away from both their homes. Vince arrived early, positioning himself to observe Riverside's behavior before making contact. The insurance investigator looked haggard, his usually neat appearance disheveled, his hands shaking as he drank coffee. When Vince introduced himself, Riverside's relief was palpable. "Mr. Murphy, I want you to know that I tried to prevent this situation, but your wife, she could be very persuasive." Vince maintained an expression of confused concern. "I'm not sure I understand. The insurance policy on your nephew. Patricia approached me months ago, before the boy even came to live with you. She said she wanted to make sure he'd be protected financially if anything happened to him. But the way she talked about it, she seemed almost eager for something to happen. It was a masterful betrayal, designed to save Riverside's own skin by painting Patty as the mastermind. She specifically asked about policies that would pay out for natural deaths caused by medical conditions. She said she was concerned about Tommy's mental health, that children who lose their parents sometimes give up. Are you suggesting my wife planned for Tommy to die?" Vince asked, injecting just the right amount of shock into his voice. "I'm saying she seemed to know more about insurance payouts for childhood deaths than most people would. And when I processed the policy, she insisted on specific clauses that would maximize the payout if the child died within the first year." Riverside leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Mr. Murphy, I think your wife may have been planning this for a long time. The timing of everything, the way she handled the application, the specific questions she asked. I should have reported it then, but she convinced me she was just being thorough." It was exactly the betrayal Vince had orchestrated. By making Riverside believe that suspicion was closing in on him, he'd motivated the man to throw Patty under the bus to save himself. Now all Vince had to do was guide that betrayal in the right direction. "If you suspected something, why didn't you report it?" Vince asked. Riverside's face flushed. Patricia and I had worked together before. At the hospital, we had a professional relationship, and I thought I might be misreading the situation. But now, with the police investigation and the evidence of insulin poisoning, you think my wife has been poisoning Tommy? I think she's capable of it, Riverside said. And I think I may have inadvertently helped her by approving a policy that would reward her for it. That evening, Vince shared the conversation with Patty, carefully omitting any mention of his role in arranging it. As he spoke, he watched his wife's face cycle through shock, anger, and finally, cold calculation. "He's lying," she said flatly. "He's trying to save himself by blaming me. But why would he lie about something so specific? Because he's the one who suggested the insurance policy in the first place. He approached me at the hospital, said he could set up something that would protect Tommy financially. I was grieving for my brother-in-law, not thinking clearly, and he took advantage of that. It was a quick recovery, but Vince could see the desperation in her eyes. Patty was realizing that her carefully constructed plan was collapsing, and her only hope was to destroy Riverside before he could destroy her. "Vincent," she said, reaching for his hands, "I think Dale has been manipulating this whole situation. What if he's the one who's been giving Tommy insulin? What if he's been coming to the house when I'm at work?" The accusation was absurd. Riverside had never been to their house, and Vince's surveillance would have captured any such visits. But he could see the logic from Patty's perspective. Frame Riverside for the poisoning while portraying herself as another victim of his manipulation. "We need to tell the police about this," Vince said, playing his role perfectly. "Yes," Patty agreed, her voice growing stronger as she convinced herself of her new story. "We need to tell them everything about Dale's behavior, his suggestions about the insurance policy, his access to insulin through his work connections." As his wife began constructing her web of lies, Vince felt a cold satisfaction. Tomorrow, he would implement the final phase of his plan, the phase that would ensure both of his enemies destroyed themselves completely while believing they were destroying each other. The endgame was about to begin. Chapter 7, The Final Gambit. Friday morning, Vince made the most important call of his campaign. Using voice alteration technology, he contacted both Patty and Riverside simultaneously, setting up a conference call that neither knew the other was on. "This is Detective Morrison," he said, perfectly mimicking the police detective's voice patterns. "We've completed our analysis of the evidence, and we need both of you to come in immediately. The district attorney is preparing charges, and we're offering one chance for cooperation before arrests are made." The response was immediate chaos. Both Patty and Riverside began talking at once, each trying to explain their innocence while inadvertently revealing their guilt. More importantly, each could hear the other's voice, realizing they were both on the call. Dale. Patty's voice was sharp with betrayal. What are you doing on this call? Patricia? I thought. The detective said I was the only one. Vince had anticipated this moment, and he guided the conversation expertly. Both of you are suspects in the attempted murder of Thomas Murphy. We have evidence of insulin poisoning, evidence of insurance fraud, and evidence of conspiracy. One of you is going to prison for attempted murder. The other might get a lighter sentence for cooperation. The silence that followed was electric with tension. Vince could almost hear their thoughts racing, each calculating how to save themselves by destroying the other. Detective, Riverside said carefully, I told Mr. Murphy yesterday about Patricia's suspicious behavior regarding the insurance policy. I have documentation of her requests, her specific questions about childhood death benefits. You bastard. Patty exploded. You were the one who suggested the whole thing. You came to me with the plan. That's a lie, and you know it. I have emails from you, Patricia. Messages where you talked about solving the Tommy problem permanently. Vince's heart raced as he listened to them destroy each other. There are no such emails. He would have found them during his surveillance. But in their panic, they were both willing to claim evidence that didn't exist. I want immunity, Patty said suddenly. Complete immunity, and I'll tell you everything about Dale's plan. She doesn't get to make deals. Riverside shouted. I'm the one who contacted Mr. Murphy yesterday. I'm the one who's been cooperating. Vince let them argue for several more minutes, each accusation becoming more desperate and more damaging. Then he delivered the killing blow. We're terminating this call, he said in the detective's voice. Both of you will be arrested within the hour. If either of you wants to make a deal, you'll need to provide concrete evidence against the other. Documentation, recordings, physical proof. Accusations aren't enough. After ending the call, Vince sat back and waited. His surveillance equipment would capture everything that happened next, and he was confident that his enemies would provide exactly the evidence he needed to destroy them both. He didn't have to wait long. Within 30 minutes, Patty was tearing through the house, searching for anything that might implicate Riverside. She found a bottle of insulin hidden in her purse and immediately drove to Riverside's house. Vince followed at a distance, watching through telephoto lenses as his wife pounded on Riverside's door. When he answered, their confrontation was visible through his living room window. You son of a bitch, Patty screamed, holding up the insulin bottle. This is your insurance policy. I'm giving this to the police and telling them you planted it in my purse. That's your insulin, Patricia. You're the nurse. You're the one with access. Not anymore. I quit my job this morning and told them you've been pressuring me to steal medical supplies for you. Riverside's face went white. You did what? I told them you were running some kind of medical fraud scheme using stolen insulin and forged prescriptions. I have recordings of our conversations where you told me how to acquire it. But Riverside had his own nuclear option. You want to play recordings? I've been recording everything since this started. I have hours of you talking about killing Tommy, about collecting the insurance money, about how we could be together once the little problem was solved. Liar. Want to hear it? Riverside pulled out his phone and played an audio file. Patty's voice came through clearly. When it's over, when Tommy's gone, we'll have $500,000 and no one to answer to. The recording was fabricated. Vince could tell from the audio compression artifacts, but Patty couldn't. Her face crumpled as she realized that Riverside had been planning to betray her from the beginning. You were recording me, she whispered. This whole time, you were setting me up. Just like you were setting me up with your fake emails and your lies to the police. The argument escalated quickly. Through his lenses, Vince watched Patty raise the insulin bottle like a weapon, threatening to smash it over Riverside's head. They struggled briefly, and the bottle shattered against the hardwood floor. Now we both go down, Patty snarled. No evidence, no insurance money, no escape plan. We're both destroyed. But she was wrong. Vince had collected all the evidence he needed, and more importantly, he had recorded their entire confrontation. Two people confessing to conspiracy, attempted murder, and insurance fraud while destroying each other in the process. As sirens approached, someone had called the police about the disturbance. Vince drove home to prepare for the final act of his revenge. Tomorrow, Detective Morrison would receive an anonymous package containing video footage, audio recordings, and documentation of the entire conspiracy. The evidence would be overwhelming and undeniable. More importantly, both Patty and Riverside would be arrested with nothing but accusations against each other. Their mutual betrayal had eliminated any possibility of cooperation or shared defense. They would go to trial separately, each trying to prove the other's guilt, each providing testimony that would ensure both their convictions. That evening, Vince sat in his study and reviewed the fruits of his campaign. In 3 weeks, he had systematically destroyed 2 people who had planned to murder an innocent child for money. They had been defeated not by superior force, but by their own greed, their own willingness to betray anyone for personal gain. Tommy was safe, the insurance money would never be paid, and justice would be served. But more than that, Vince had proved something to himself, that betrayal would always carry a price, and that he was capable of collecting that debt with interest. The game was nearly over. Only the final moves remained. Chapter 8, The Reckoning. Saturday morning, Detective Morrison received an unmarked package at the police station. Inside, she found a USB drive containing over 40 hours of surveillance footage, detailed financial records, and audio recordings that documented the entire conspiracy against Tommy Murphy. The evidence was so comprehensive that the district attorney's office moved immediately. By noon, arrest warrants had been issued for both Patricia Murphy and Dale Riverside on charges of attempted murder, conspiracy, insurance fraud, and child endangerment. Patty was arrested at home, where she had been packing hastily, apparently planning to flee. The arresting officers found her with $15,000 in cash and a plane ticket to Costa Rica, evidence that suggested she had escape plans independent of Riverside. Riverside was arrested at his office, where he had been attempting to destroy documents related to Tommy's insurance policy. Security cameras captured him feeding papers into a shredder, providing additional evidence of obstruction of justice. By Saturday evening, both were in custody, each believing the other had provided the evidence that led to their arrests. Vince spent the weekend playing the role of the shocked husband and guardian. He met with police investigators, insurance representatives, and child protective services workers, all while maintaining perfect innocence. His performance was flawless, a man betrayed by his wife, confused by the revelation of her crimes, focused only on protecting his nephew's well-being. "I can't believe Patricia was capable of this," he told Detective Morrison during his formal interview. "I trusted her completely. We both love Tommy like our own son. Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones we know least," Morrison replied. "The evidence suggests this conspiracy began months before Tommy came to live with you. Your wife and Mr. Riverside were planning this before his parents even died." The implication was staggering. Vince had suspected that Patty and Riverside were opportunists who had seized on Tommy's tragedy, but the evidence suggested something far more sinister. They had been waiting for Mike and Linda to die, positioning themselves to profit from the orphan child's death. Monday brought the first court appearances. Vince attended both hearings, sitting in the gallery like any other concerned family member. He watched with cold satisfaction as Patty and Riverside were brought in separately, each looking haggard and desperate after their weekend in jail. During Patty's arraignment, her court-appointed attorney tried to argue for bail, claiming she was a respected nurse with no criminal history and strong ties to the community. But the prosecutor presented evidence of her flight preparations and the severity of the charges against her. Bail was denied. Riverside's hearing was equally damaging. The prosecutor revealed that he had been under investigation by multiple agencies for insurance fraud, and that the case against Tommy represented a pattern of suspicious policies he had approved. His attorney's request for bail was also denied. Outside the courthouse, Vince was approached by a reporter from the local news station. "Mr. Murphy, how does it feel to know that your wife was allegedly poisoning your nephew?" "It feels like a nightmare," Vince replied, his voice heavy with apparent grief. "I trusted Patricia with Tommy's life. I can't imagine how someone could hurt an innocent child who had already lost so much." The interview aired that evening, reinforcing Vince's image as another victim of the conspiracy. The story gained national attention. A grieving child slowly poisoned by his caregiver, while she and her lover waited to collect insurance money. Public opinion was overwhelmingly sympathetic to Vince and Tommy, while condemnation of Patty and Riverside was swift and merciless. Over the following weeks, more details emerged during the legal proceedings. The prosecution revealed that Patty had been administering insulin to Tommy for over a month, carefully escalating the doses to simulate a natural decline. Riverside had helped her structure the insurance policy to maximize the payout while minimizing suspicion. But the most damaging evidence came from their own recorded conversations, the mutual betrayals and accusations that Vince had orchestrated during his fake police call. Both Patty and Riverside had made statements that could only be interpreted as confessions, and their attempts to blame each other had eliminated any possibility of claiming innocence. Patty's defense team tried to argue that she had been manipulated by Riverside, that her nursing background had been exploited by a sophisticated insurance fraud expert. But the evidence showed that she had been an active and willing participant, someone who had taken out the policy before Tommy had even come to live with them. Riverside's attorneys took the opposite approach, claiming that Patty had seduced him into the scheme, using their romantic relationship to manipulate him into approving a fraudulent policy. But financial records showed that he had profited significantly from similar questionable policies in the past, suggesting a pattern of criminal behavior. The media coverage intensified as the trials approached. Tommy's story became a symbol of child endangerment and insurance fraud, while Vince was portrayed as a heroic guardian who had saved his nephew from certain death. Interview requests poured in, but Vince declined them all, claiming he wanted to focus on Tommy's recovery and healing. In private, however, Vince was already planning the next phase of his life. He had liquidated most of their shared assets before Patty's arrest, ensuring that her legal defense would be poorly funded. He had also begun the process of adopting Tommy officially, removing any remaining legal connection between the boy and his attempted murderer. Most importantly, he had started a new business venture, a security consulting firm that specialized in personal protection and threat assessment. His reputation as someone who had uncovered and stopped a conspiracy against his own family would be invaluable in attracting clients who needed similar protection. As the trial dates approached, Vince reflected on what he had accomplished. He had saved Tommy's life, destroyed two people who had planned to murder a child for money, and positioned himself to profit from the experience. He had proven that betrayal would always carry a price, and that he was capable of exacting that price with surgical precision. The final act of justice was about to begin, and Vince would be there to watch his enemies face the consequences of their choices. Chapter 9. Justice Served. The trials began 6 months after the arrests, with Patty and Riverside being prosecuted separately to prevent any coordination in their defenses. Vince attended every day, sitting in the front row of the gallery, playing the role of the grieving husband and protective guardian. Patty's trial came first. Her defense attorney, overwhelmed by the evidence and working with limited resources due to Vince's careful financial maneuvering, tried to paint her as a victim of Riverside's manipulation. But the prosecution's case was devastating. They presented the surveillance footage showing Patty administering insulin to Tommy, the audio recordings of her conversations with Riverside about the insurance policy, and the financial records proving she had taken out the policy before Tommy had even come to live with them. Most damaging of all were her own words during the confrontation at Riverside's house, recorded by Vince's surveillance equipment. "When it's over, when Tommy's gone, we'll have $500,000 and no one to answer to." The prosecutor played back Patty's voice to the jury. "These are not the words of someone being manipulated. These are the words of someone planning the murder of an 8-year-old child." Tommy testified via closed-circuit television, his innocence and vulnerability providing a stark contrast to the calculating cruelty of the defendants. He described feeling sick after taking his vitamins, the strange taste in his mouth, and the way he would become sleepy and confused. "Aunt Patty said the vitamins would make me big and strong like Uncle Vince," Tommy told the court, his small voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. "But they made me feel bad instead." Vince was called as a witness for the prosecution, and his testimony was masterful. He described his growing concerns about Tommy's health, his decision to install surveillance cameras to monitor the boy's care, and his shock at discovering his wife's betrayal. "I trusted Patricia completely," he said, his voice breaking convincingly. "She was a registered nurse, a professional caregiver. I never imagined she could hurt a child who had already lost everything." When Patty's attorney cross-examined him, trying to suggest that Vince might have known about the insurance policy, his response was devastating. "If I had known my wife was planning to murder my nephew for money, I would have turned her in to the police immediately. No amount of money is worth a child's life." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: attempted murder, conspiracy, insurance fraud, and child endangerment. Patty's sentencing was scheduled for the following month. Riverside's trial followed a similar pattern, but with an additional element of desperation. His attorney had tried to negotiate a plea bargain, but the prosecution, bolstered by public outrage and overwhelming evidence, refused to consider anything less than full accountability. The evidence against Riverside was equally damning. Financial records showed he had profited from suspicious insurance policies for years, suggesting Tommy's case was part of a larger pattern of fraud. Email records revealed he had researched the timing of insurance payouts for childhood deaths and the medical conditions that would trigger maximum benefits. Most damaging were the recorded conversations where he discussed accelerating the timeline for Tommy's death and his detailed knowledge of how insulin could be used to cause gradual organ failure in a child. When Riverside took the stand in his own defense, his attorney tried to portray him as someone who had been seduced into the scheme by Patty's medical expertise and romantic manipulation. But under cross-examination, the prosecutor demolished this narrative. "Mr. Riverside, you are an insurance investigator with 15 years of experience. Are you telling this jury that you didn't recognize the signs of insurance fraud when you approved a $500,000 policy on a child whose parents had just died?" Patricia convinced me it was legitimate, and when she asked specific questions about policies that would pay double for deaths caused by natural medical conditions, that didn't raise any red flags. She said she was just being thorough. "Mr. Riverside, how many legitimate policies have you approved where the beneficiary researched the specific circumstances that would maximize the payout before the insured party even came into their custody?" Riverside had no answer. His conviction was even swifter than Patty's. The jury deliberated for just 2 hours before finding him guilty on all charges. The sentencing hearings were held on the same day, creating a media spectacle that drew national attention. Vince had prepared a victim impact statement that was both heartbreaking and damning. "Tommy Murphy is 8 years old," he began, his voice steady but filled with controlled emotion. "He had already lost his parents in a tragic accident when he came to live with us. He trusted the adults in his life to protect him, to care for him, to help him heal from his trauma. Instead, my wife and her accomplice saw him as an opportunity for profit. They planned his death before he even moved into our home. They took out an insurance policy on his life and then began slowly poisoning him, documenting his decline to support their eventual claim. Tommy will carry the scars of this betrayal for the rest of his life. He trusted his aunt to care for him, and she fed him poison. He trusted the system to protect him, and an insurance investigator tried to profit from his death. I asked this court to impose the maximum sentence allowed by law. These defendants showed no mercy to an innocent child. They deserve none in return." Judge Harrison, a stern woman with 30 years on the bench, was clearly moved by Vince's statement and disgusted by the defendant's crimes. Her sentencing was swift and merciless. Patricia Murphy received 25 years to life for attempted murder, with additional sentences for conspiracy and fraud to be served concurrently. She would not be eligible for parole for 20 years. Dale Riverside received 22 years to life, with similar restrictions on parole eligibility. Additionally, he was ordered to pay restitution to the insurance company and faced federal charges for mail fraud that could add additional years to his sentence. As the defendants were led away in shackles, Vince felt a profound sense of completion. The people who had planned to murder Tommy for money would spend the rest of their productive lives in prison. Justice had been served, and the price of betrayal had been paid in full. Outside the courthouse, Vince was approached by reporters seeking comment on the sentences. His response was measured and appropriate. No sentence can undo the harm that was done to Tommy. But I hope these convictions send a message that children will be protected and that those who prey on the innocent will face the full consequences of their actions. That evening, Vince returned home to find Tommy playing in the backyard, laughing and running with the energy of a healthy 8-year-old. The boy's recovery had been complete once the insulin poisoning stopped, and with proper therapy, he was beginning to heal from the psychological trauma as well.